Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 16th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The Gospel of the Lord. A few weeks ago, I attended a writing conference at Minnesota, hence my appreciation for words. But it was a whole week that was devoted to sitting and talking and learning about how to write on faith. For me, it was sort of a chance of a lifetime. I received a grant from a place called the Lilly Foundation, so they paid for everything. My airfare, my room and board, which was on a lake in the woods in Minnesota, housed on the campus of St. John's Abbey, with fabulous food, especially as a vegetarian. They had like all this great food and wonderful, wonderful instructors. So it was sort of like heaven for a theology geek. There are many, many conferences on theological writing. There are other options that I could have applied to, but this was the one that I really wanted. And the reason that I applied for this specific one was because it was about writing theologically for the public square. The public square piece is what captured my interest. So, when you look at conferences and stuff, they always have subtitles to give you a little bit more of what it's actually going to be about. And the subtitle was Posts, Tweets, Blogs, and Faith. And since I blog somewhat regularly, depending upon time constraints and inspiration, and I most certainly Facebook post and tweet in this day and age, it intrigued me quite a bit. When I was a solo pastor, I only had office help, like part-time, and so some days it would be me and my office and my computer. It wasn't quite as busy of a place as it is here. So there were days where my only vehicle for social interaction was Facebook. It was and is a place to engage. We know that social media can sort of quickly go awry. There are false stories are quickly propagated. And since the advent of social media, there's also been a steep rise in cyberbullying, right? A couple years ago, we didn't even have this word cyberbullying. And also, if you're on Facebook or Twitter or any of those things, you know that there are only so many pictures of somebody's dinner or beer of the day that you can actually look at. So the question of the content is debatable, but the fact remains that speech and text and posts and updates, all of this stuff completely and totally permeates our lives today. Even if you aren't on any of these newer platforms, there's no way that we can deny that the speed at which information comes at us is sort of at a dizzying pace in today's day and age. Social media has become today's modern public square. It is a figurative place of assembly where people grapple with politics, philosophy, and religion. If you think back throughout history, religion has always been a part of the public square, because the beliefs and views that it held were expected to impact society. Had religion not had a voice in public square, it would have been saying by admission that, well, we have nothing to say to that. So the church has always spoke. People like Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin all use their voices and their clout to bring faith out of the church and into the public arena. And so did people like Martin Luther King Jr. And for that matter, Martin Luther, right? He nailed his 95 Theses not inside the church, outside on the church door, so anybody that walked by could read them and see them. This tradition of religious people speaking and conversing in the public square also goes all the way back to Moses and the prophets. Prophets in the Bible did many things. Some were healed, some did miracles, some lived upright and moral lives. And also, sort of like I've talked about with the kids, some were a little odd and eccentric. They did things like strip themselves naked and eat piles of manure and hide their underwear. All these things, I'm telling you, they're all in the Bible. I'm not making it up. But they did all of them in the name of God. But regardless of their eccentric ways, every prophet had a special gift. And Jeremiah's gift was speech in the public square. Now at this point, it would probably be easy for you to follow along my stream of thinking and say, okay, I totally know where Pastor is going with this. She is going to tell me that I should be more intentional about talking about religion in my daily life, or she is going to tell me to be more prophetic, or she's going to tell me I really should nail down that special gift that I know God has given me. And all of that is true. But Jeremiah does something really curious this week. Probably not as curious as when he hid his underwear, but very odd if his calling in life is to speak to people about God. If he's supposed to be speaking, what Jeremiah does this week is he says nothing. He's silent. His job is to have something to say. It would almost be like if I stood up here in front of you and said, well, I've got nothing, which, believe me, there are weeks where I think I just might have nothing come Sunday. But regardless, if it's a little tricky to tell, but if you were to be able to follow in that Jeremiah passage we have in the bulletin, at verse 17, Jeremiah recounts how he sat alone under the weight of the Word of God, and he watched everything that was going on around him, and he sat there in silence. When there's so much to talk about, and there are so many things to figure out, and also there are so many different platforms on which he could have spoke, Jeremiah's decision to hold his tongue makes me wonder why he chose to be silent. It seems very, very contrary. Especially it seems contrary to being prophetic. And as many of you know, I am all about let's make a difference, let's not sit still, let's let the voice of the church be heard, let's be prophets in our own right. I'm not very much a sit still and keep quiet kind of person. And so to contemplate what God could be saying to us to keep silent, like it would be like in the Bible, you know, the prophet is always the word of the Lord came to me, right? And so it would be like if I were to say to you, the word of the Lord came to me and God said, shut up. Jeremiah was one of several hundred prophets speaking in Jerusalem. Excess speech and noise from religious leaders is nothing new. And I'm also sure that they had their own kind of form of the Joel Osteens or Pat Roberts or anybody. Anybody can tweet. Anybody can make noise. Anybody can forward a post. Anyone can get into a debate around the kitchen table. Anyone, especially around here, anyone can march on DC. It doesn't mean we're prophetic. It doesn't mean we're representative. It doesn't even mean that we're helpful in the kingdom of God. It might just mean we're noisy. Sometimes we assume that we know best. We know what the person we're talking at needs to hear or what the person is thinking. We decide what the person has to say or is feeling even before the words come out of their mouths. We tend to put words in their mouths. Maybe one of the reasons that we as a church tend to speak loudly and carry a big stick on some items is we want to make sure that we're not forgotten or insulted in the public square. We need to defend ourselves, we often feel. Make sure we aren't discounted. But if you ask Jeremiah, it's not easy to hold your tongue, but sometimes it's necessary. But what we tend to do is say something, anything, and we seek consolation in something and anything. Presuming, just as we do with people, that we know what God is thinking, even before we have asked God. The plethora of statements that are made in the name of God are staggering. And yet, sometimes those same statements seem devoid of mutuality. Are they God's words? Or are they our words? Or how do we even know whose words they are? Jeremiah's words and actions are in some ways more timely today than they were when he very first uttered them. Which says a lot, right, for the Word of God, that still continues to speak in this day and age. It's possible that I didn't need to go to Minnesota to learn how to enact faith in the public square. That maybe I just needed to read the Bible. See, I have been saying all along that Jeremiah doesn't speak. And he doesn't. At least not to the people. But he does talk and cry and yell at God. Jeremiah, in his isolated state, ultimately isn't alone. He seeks consolation and guidance from God first. Before saying anything, Jeremiah has a conversation with God. And we can call it prayer, we can call it argument, we can call it worship, because in some ways it's all those things rolled up into one. But he sits alone and he talks and he listens, and then he sits some more and he listens some more. Despite his silence in the public square, Jeremiah is thinking with God. And conversation is this natural way that we think together. Our words are meant to connect us with God and with each other in public arenas and in private arenas. But I would venture to say that despite the myriad of ways that we have to connect with one another today, most of us feel more disconnected and more unheard than ever before. Part of the reason that people are drawn to Facebook and to marches and to causes is because we have this longing to be connected. We want to feel like we're part of something bigger and grander. It's really easy to talk at people and at situations and at God. There's not that much that's hard about talking at something. So many words and so little connection. But it's not easy to begin talking together with one another, either individually or collectively. And let's be honest, it's sometimes not very easy to talk to God, and it's also oftentimes really hard to hear what God has to say. But conversation is not just telling and spewing and opinionizing. Conversation requires that we extend ourselves, and we open our hearts and our minds a bit more. That we turn to somebody else really curious about their life. That puts us in a really vulnerable position to allow ourselves to be that close to another person. I believe that it would make us cry out, just like Jeremiah did. Ultimately, he cried out to God because he cared so very, very much about what was going on in the world and what he saw around him. But how do we begin? If all this stuff is true, if there's more than enough words in the world and not enough connection, if there's more than enough noise in the world and not enough quiet, and if as a church we're also called to speak of God, what shall we do? Sit. I mean, that's what Jeremiah does. And maybe that's the prophetic message to us today, to sit and to listen. One of my recent little epiphanies in relation to writing is that sometimes the truest thoughts rise out of listening to the silence. Often I hate that my job is to speak words that I think God would speak to us. It feels like such a heavy, weighty burden to me. It's a gift, for sure, but it's also a weight to bear. But as I thought and I prayed through Jeremiah, I do think that the prophetic message that God would say to us today is to sit together, to listen and worry and dream together, and reclaim that gift of conversation. Because that's our route back to one another and back to God. And all the stuff that's required to do that, we already have. It just takes a little bit of courage and a little bit of faith and the willingness to keep silent and the willingness to speak your heart when necessary. And I believe that the Church Universal and nations and communities and families, that if we can begin to sit together and talk about what's important to us, we'll become more alive, more human, more the people and creation that God intends us to be. And we'll be more attuned to ourselves and connected to